Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, foes and Flabbergastas, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. To accomplish that goal I suggest gear that allows for high damage and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. Today's class of choice is the Warrior and the elite specialization is the Berserker. We're going to talk through two different build variants, an open world roaming build and a power DPS variant. The links to the builds are as always in the description of the video. But before we dive in, let's talk some pros and cons of Berserker. Like all Warrior elite specializations, it has very strong passive healing in open world due to might stacking. It also has great support capabilities because you can share quickness and might with your subgroup. And all that while doing very nice damage and good burst damage with an engaging but not overwhelming rotation. One of the downsides of the build is that you're constantly racing the clock when it comes to Berserk mode, there are no breaks in. And also the build is fully melee, which can be an issue in some encounters. But let's dive into the build. Yo, this is a build guide for all the angry folks out there. Just in time for the Berserker buffs in the latest patch, I've got a Berserker guide for you. In this simplified jack of all trades Berserker build we'll be using dual axes and a longbow. You can also add 2 maces for CC or a greatsword for more damage, but it's not required. Before we go into the details of the build, I'll go through the main determinants of the Berserker playstyle. On core Warrior you have access to burst skills that you can use when you have enough adrenaline. The adrenaline bar can be found right above your weapon skills. On the lead spec Berserker however, these change into primal burst skills. You can only use those in Berserk mode, for which you need to obtain 30 adrenaline to activate. In this mode, you gain increased attack speed and other benefits, depending on the trait choices you make, but more on that later. Berserk mode does not have a cast time, so you can activate it during skill channels as well. For primal burst skills, your adrenaline bar needs to be full, but the maximum adrenaline in Berserk mode is reduced to 10, so all primal burst skills are considered as tier 1 bursts. For all weapons in the build, primal bursts are the most powerful skills you have available, so you want to use them whenever they are off cooldown. Berserker also grants access to rage abilities. All rage skills extend Berserk mode duration upon use and give you at least 5 adrenaline, so in theory you can extend the duration of Berserk mode pretty much infinitely. This is also why the build relies heavily on high alacrity uptime and group content, because not having it makes sustaining Berserk mode and having all the benefits that come with it much harder. And it is very important to sustain Berserk mode because it entails a very large gain in damage via higher crit chance, critical damage and 25% strike damage. So in general, you'll want to try and maintain Berserk mode as long as possible, but there are fights with phases or pauses where you cannot damage anything. In those cases it can actually be advantageous to have Berserk mode run out right when those pauses occur, to have it ready to activate when you can damage again. In order to do that, simply skip your few rage abilities which extend Berserk mode prior to the pause. I had to get used to this on a bunch of fights and noticed a large damage gain after I did. Alright, moving on to dual axes. This is the main weapon set since it does by far the most damage on its own. Let's start with the burst skill because it is the main focus of the rotation, Decapitate. To be honest, it feels kinda paradox to repeatedly cut someone's head off. Enemies are probably wearing very strong neck armor against Warrior these days. Decapitate is single target only, but has a very high damage coefficient and recharges itself when it hits. If done right, you can spam this skill. More on that when we talk about rotation and skill prioritization though. The auto attack chain on dual axis doesn't do anything very interesting other than damage. Keep in mind that the final hit does the most damage, but also takes a lot longer than the first two. The second axe skill is Cyclone Axe, a short cooldown, high damage and vulnerability skill. It also gives you Fury and is very powerful, so it will typically be used as fast as possible. Skill number 3 is Throw Axe. It's a ranged skill that has an execute multiplier to its damage, which is why it becomes more important to the less health enemies have. Next up we got Dual Strike. Like all the X skills, it has a great power coefficient and also grants you quickness 2 times for a total of 4 seconds without wound duration. In group content this is kinda lackluster, so it's mainly used for damage. In solo gameplay and open world where you often do not have quickness, this is pretty essential. The last skill is Whirling Axe, and this is the most powerful skill in the kit when it comes to DPS per cast, especially outside of Berserk mode. Just keep in mind that it's also a very long channel that can be interrupted, so you need to anticipate the time windows during which you can actually use it. You should also try to not delay rage skills too much with this, because it has a very long cast time. As a secondary weapon we will use a longbow. This is just there for a ranged option on demand for open world where you cannot be in melee range all the time. You could technically also use a rifle, but longbow is actually more fun, more flexible and higher cleave damage. You can also swap to longbow in group content in cases where you cannot be in melee. Never stay on it for longer than needed though. The longbow skills don't really have good power damage. Longbow 3 is the only skill that does good enough power damage in the kit. Longbow 4 and 5 apply CC, so you can use them to break Defiance bars in combination with Headbutt and Wild Blow. I also want to mention Greatsword here, because it is the secondary weapon for the highest benchmark rotation as of now. So if you want to try an alternative weapon for open world and or want to work towards the highest benchmark rotation, Greatsword is a very good option too. Moving on to utilities. For the healing skill, true Berserkers only have one option, Blood Reckoning. This is an immortality button as long as you deal damage and rewards offensive gameplay. It extends Berserk mode duration since it is a rage skill, grants adrenaline, heals you on cast and also heals you for 33% of your outgoing damage for 5 seconds, effectively making you unkillable in group content. Don't underestimate the utility this has, because you can actually pump through quite a few damaging mechanics with this. But not only that, it recharges all primal burst skills as well, so you can use it after Decapitate to use it again right after. The first regular utility slot depends on the encounter. In open world I usually run 4 Great Justice for higher Fury and Might coverage, that also applies to allies. In group content what you run here depends on the fight. If you want to be able to sustain Berserk mode as long as you want to, run Shattering Blow. This grants you stability, does damage and extends Berserk mode further. This option is good for fights that allow you to permanently deal damage to something without pauses. In shorter, burstier fights with pauses, like Kinding Overlock for example, or whenever you do mechanics that disrupt your rotation, use Signet of Might here. That will give you free passive power, since further extending Berserker mode won't do anything for you in those cases. As I said before, it's actually important to not overextend Berserk mode in many fights, because otherwise you may have it run out just before the pause and the fight ends, lowering your damage noticeably. In the next 2 slots I always run Wild Blow and Outrage. They both extend Berserk mode duration, and Outrage allows you to stun break very frequently and is the largest contributor to Berserk mode duration. The lead of choice is always Headbutt. This does a lot of damage in CC and is a movement skill. Its main downside is that it stuns yourself on hit, so ideally you'd either provide yourself with stability beforehand or break the stun as soon as possible. This skill also grants 30 adrenaline, so you can always activate Berserk mode after using this. That's why it's always used as an opener, so that you can immediately start zerking it up. With Outrage you have a stun break available that lines up perfectly with Headbutt. As long as you use it on cooldown you can break every stun on Headbutt with it. The other option is to use Shattering Blow beforehand, since it gives you 2 seconds of stability. Finally, note that all rage skills extend Berserk mode only if they hit, or in the case of Outrage whenever an enemy is nearby. That's why you need to stay in melee range to keep Berserk mode up. Moving on to gear and consumables. Since we're playing Fashion Wars and Berserkers burn a lot of calories, gear and consumables do matter. We're going to use a mix of Assassins and Berserker. The mix should be chosen so that you reach 60% crit chance unbuffed and outside of Berserk mode. This puts you at pretty much exactly 100% crit chance, with the 15% from Smash Brawler and 25% from Fury. With exotic gear you will have to mix in more Assassin pieces and or swap to Precision Food if you want to cap out on crit chance. Overall, additional support and survivability can be accommodated for through traits and skill choices, so there's no reason to use anything defensive or supporty here. I'll cover the more survivable options later. As for sigils, you can run a combination of Force and Impact or Force and Air. Impact also boosts cleave damage and adds damage versus stunned enemies, and they are only marginally different, so I usually go with Impact. In terms of consumables, I run Power and Ferocity Food and the Potent Superior Sharpening Stone or any equivalent to it for most content. If you want, you can also run a Writ of Masterful Strength for a small power boost, and the Ascended version of the food is always better than not having it. Next up we have specializations and traits. The 2 specializations that are set in stone are Strength and Berserker. For the third specialization you always have the choice between Tactics and Discipline. We'll be starting with Strength, because that is included in both build variants. As always, I'm not going to go through every trait in detail. I'm just going to look at the ones that make up for the main differences between the build variants and explain why I made those choices. In Strength, we'll be using all the juicy damage buffs we can get. 5% increased strike damage, an additional 10% for 6 seconds upon using a physical skill, converting power to both vitality and ferocity, and finally up to 21% increased damage upon using burst skills. Strength will also make your dodges apply might and damage enemies, make burst skills restore endurance on hit, and have might grant more power to you, 40 per stack instead of 30. Finally, it now also gives you 5% crit chance. When it comes to damage, this specialization is an absolute powerhouse. As the second core specialization for open world I prefer Tactics, while in group content I usually run Discipline. Tactics adds a lot of utility and survivability to your kit while providing great burst damage. It grants 10% increased damage versus movement impaired enemies, 1% damage for every boon on you, 25% more damage against targets above 80% health. Also, once every 10 seconds you share might and quickness with allies whenever you hit with the burst skill. We'll also talk about Tactics again when we talk about survivability. For the power DPS build, you can either run Discipline or Tactics. Tactics give you a stronger opener and higher overall damage with a lower weight of damage coming from your burst skill. Discipline is very good and more forgiving for dual axes because the traits of choice synergize perfectly with them. You get increased strike damage while running melee weapons, shorter burst skill cooldowns and a lot of ferocity when using axes. The reduced skill cooldowns also affect Berserker mode, so if you drop out of it, you can re-enter quicker. Discipline further improves weapon swapping by halving its cooldown to 5 seconds only and grants adrenaline, might, fury and swiftness when weapon swapping. If you want those benefits without much added complexity, you can put one axe on each weapon set and swap as much as you can. The most important trait here for group content is Axe Mastery. Since it gives you adrenaline on every critical hit with axe skills, and with 100% crit, that is a safe 66% adrenaline increase per hit. With this trait, you only need 3 hits with axe skills to completely fill your adrenaline in Berserk mode, so you can spam Decapitate over and over again and just fill the gaps in between with different skill combos. Compared to the Tactics rotation, this enables more consistent usage of Decapitate, but the overall damage modifiers are lower. The last specialization is of course Berserker. Here we go with anything that increases strike damage. With these traits, we gain 25% damage, 300 power and an additional 15% crit chance when in Berserk mode. Finally, we also get a conversion of precision into ferocity, which doubles when in Berserk mode. These traits here are why it is so important to remain in Berserk mode as much as possible. You'll also gain quickness, resistance and super speed when you enter Berserk mode, which is nice to have in open world where you won't be sustaining it as much. Speaking of open world, that brings me to adjusting for survivability. For open world, it can make sense to make a build more forgiving so that you can sustain on your own. On Berserker, this consists of providing fury, might and a good amount of quickness for yourself and maximizing the number of might stacks you generate per second. You will also be providing might and quickness around you, which is pretty nice. As usual, we'll follow a particular priority list for survivability changes. Gear is expensive unless you have legendary gear, so we'll adjust food and traits first. The trait swaps are centered around might generation because of the synergy between might makes right in strength and mending might in tactics. These two will heal you for 200 health for every stack of might you apply to yourself and 70 for every stack you apply to allies. In strength, I typically use Brave Stride as the first choice because it makes movement skills grant 5 seconds of stability. The main reason for this is that it will make Headbutt apply stability on its own, allowing you to consistently bypass the self-stun on it. After that, Forceful Greatsword is an essential trait for might generation. The trait itself grants a 50% chance on critical hits to apply a stack of might to yourself and adds 120 power. With the Greatsword, these two effects are doubled. That means that every second hit will heal you, because you usually have 100% crit chance with Fury. Aside from the higher crit damage compared to other classes in group content, this is also why having such a high crit chance is so important. In Tactics, you have 2 additional options to increase self-healing. You can use Empower Allies to share might with allies every 10 seconds, and whenever you have allies around you, using Phalanx Strength makes you a walking immortal might bot. This will share every stack of might you apply to yourself with allies. Every stack of might you generate will apply to up to 5 allies and heal you for 70 per allies. That's close to 500 healing per stack when you share might with 5 allies. If these adjustments are not enough for you, you can also put a strength sigil on instead of the impact sigil. In terms of food, you can change to the fried golden dumpling for might generation on critical hits. This does not have an internal cooldown, resulting in even more healing. It also helps with boon coverage through concentration, which is pretty nice. If all of those changes are not enough for you, which they should be, you can exchange a few armor pieces to knights to exchange ferocity for toughness. Keep in mind that the playstyle requires you to be aggressive to heal. You can swap to longbow in cases where being in melee is too dangerous, but in any kind of scenario where you are not alone, there should not be really dangerous scenarios due to the absurd amounts of healing that you generate. In the final part of the video, I wanted to give some guidance on 2 simplified Berserker rotations that allow you to concentrate on mechanics and do well enough. We're gonna camp dual axis and maintain Berserk mode for the entire fight whenever possible. This works better on fights that don't have immunity phases or breaks in between, like Sabathur, Doom and the like. You will also have to remain in melee range at all times to execute this well.
Compared to the more complex rotation that involves greatsword, the ones I employ will cost you some damage, but still do more than enough to feel comfortable in most groups, and they don't require you to weapon store or weapon swap at any time. Take these rotations as stepping stones for more complex rotations or for whenever you want a more relaxed experience without too much of a loss in efficiency. The first rotation uses discipline and generates a very consistent amount of adrenaline and damage. The main points of emphasis of the rotation are Berserk mode extensions and Decapitate, both of which you will spam as often as possible. In general, we need to obtain 10 adrenaline to be able to use Decapitate again. That can be done by using any 3 hits with axe skills or using rage skills, since rage skills also give adrenaline. In general, you can look at the following combos as a guideline to use after every cast of Decapitate. As I said before, when it comes to circumventing the self-stun on a headbutt, you can either use Shattering Blow or Outrage paired with it. Shattering Blow has to be used before, and Outrage has to be used just in the moment where the stun applies. On top of that, Outrage and Blood Reckoning will immediately give you Decapitate back, so you can use Decapitate, one of those skills, and then Decapitate again. When it comes to the headbutt stun, you can also just look at the boons that you have, and if you see that you have stability on you, you can also just use headbutt whenever you want. Once you've done a little bit of golem practice, you'll realize that the cooldowns of Headbutt, Outrage, Blood Reckoning and Wild Blow line up, so you can use them in the same order every rotation loop. Each loop should take between 15 and 16 seconds to do so. The cooldown of Shattering Blow and Headbutt don't line up, so you need to delay Shattering Blow a little bit to be able to use it before Headbutt. You can use Wild Blow and Headbutt outside of Berserk mode whenever crowd control is needed. So all you have to do is to spam the before mentioned combinations with Decapitate and win. The second rotation uses Tactics instead of Discipline. This will lead to lower adrenaline generation since we don't have Axe Mastery. In this rotation you need to make use of the rage skills in a more strict pattern, because they are the main source of quick adrenaline generation. All of them give at least 5 adrenaline, but the heal skill, Headbutt and Outrage give 10. After these you can always use Decapitate directly. For the other 2 rage skills, you kinda need 5 here, you'll have to throw in Axe skills to fill adrenaline up. Axe 5 always completely fills up the adrenaline bar, so it's a very good way to do so. The general concept is similar to the Discipline rotation in that you use Decapitate as much as possible, but you'll have a few windows during which it will take a bit longer to fill adrenaline up. In the Tactics rotation you will actually have time to do 1 complete auto attack chain per loop once you have used all the adrenaline skills in Whirling Axe, so try to not interrupt that one. The Tactics rotation is a bit lower APM, but also more punishing on misclicks for your rage skills. In the end, just try out both and see which one you like best. I can reliably get to around 36k DPS on both of them without Signet of Might. In case you want to use Signet of Might in either build for higher burst at the cost of Berserk mode uptime, replace Shattering Blow. In that case you will need to use Outrage to break the headbutt stun. Overall, in my opinion, Dual Axe Berserker has one of the most fun rotations in the game. It is fast paced and engaging, but it does not include too many layers, so it isn't too difficult to do well enough on it. Over the last year or so it lacked damage in comparison to other specializations, but now it is back and viable. It does take a bit of practice to master though, especially if you want to min-max every aspect of it and adjust the Berserk mode uptimes to specific encounters. That said, the deed for me is done for now. I hope this was insightful for you and made you want to try Berserker. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm, and happy raging.